So welcome. So this is our third class in this series of 6 on the 6 perfections, the 6 paramitas. And tonight we're going to work with patience, one of our favorites. So let's go ahead and get started with the prayers. And I'm going to need to share the screen, John, when you're ready. Be able to put the prayers up for everyone. So as usual, we're going to do the praise to Shakimuni Buddha to begin with. And then after that, we'll do the short mandala offering. And then, of course, refuge and bodhicitta that we'll do. Okay, so do you need me? Okay. No, it's still not up, John. I don't know. Came up with a little screen saying something about giving me permission to record, but it's not allowing me to screen share yet.
For some reason, I cannot make you a co-host. That option. Let me try something.
I think it's there now. No, it isn't. Let me see.
Let me try something else.
Okay. Zoom still manages to baffle us sometimes. So, I think it's there now. Yes, it is. Wonderful. All right, so let's begin with the praise. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Let's do the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then finally, refuge and bodhicitta, which we'll do first in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Druparsho. All right, let's do a short meditation. Again, meditation just gives us an opportunity to come into this space with our minds a bit more focused, a little bit clearer of whatever preoccupations we might have from our day. So spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath. using that as your meditation object in whatever way you prefer. Try to keep the mind with the breath. Whenever the mind wanders, gently guide the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes after I ring the bell. And then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection to strengthen our bodhicitta motivation before we begin. So now let's set our motivation for tonight. And recall that in this class in particular, this course, we're looking at these practices of a bodhisattva, which, if we think about this mind of bodhicitta, that is our motivation, we see that these 6 are the means for us to be able to develop our own minds completely into the state of Buddhahood. They are what will be essential to our becoming qualified to aid beings so that they too can achieve this state. So it is important when we're engaging in teachings about the 6 perfections to generate that mind of bodhicitta that is rooted in the understanding that we are all the same in terms of wanting to be happy, wanting to not suffer, and that the path that the Buddha taught will lead to those results. And we acknowledge that although we too have that same motivation, we want to be primarily focused on the needs of others, on their happiness, their well-being, their freedom from suffering. So we generate a very compassionate wish, motivated also by loving kindness towards these beings, a sincere wish to help them to the greatest degree. And then the acknowledgement that to do that perfectly, we have to become enlightened ourselves. Therefore, we need these practices. We need to transcend our own limitations in regard to these perfections, to continue to advance and develop our abilities, our skill, so that we then can eventually cross that threshold and become a Buddha ourselves. And in that state of enlightenment, we can work perfectly to help others on their path of awakening. So really feel this motivation in your heart right now, this sincere wish to be of the greatest benefit to all beings. and the recognition that to do that, we have to become enlightened ourselves. It's for this reason that we're engaging in this class tonight. Okay, again, thank you all for joining tonight for this third class. We get to deal with the perhaps one of the more challenging ones of the six perfections, perfecting our patience. Certainly in the times that we're living in, we have lots of things that can cause anger to arise, cause us to be somewhat upset, annoyed, irritated at things that are going on in our world, at others in our world, and so on. So these teachings are valuable all the time, but they're particularly valuable during this time that we're going through right now. I went back to check because I know that I did a course for all of you at City Garba on called Finding Calm in the Storm. And the dates for that, I guess, were beginning of 2020, right when the pandemic was beginning. So it's interesting to sort of revisit this whole idea of how do we work with cultivating patience a little over a year after those teachings. Of course, I went into much more detail because it was an entire course devoted to practices of patience and how we work with that. So tonight I won't be able to touch on obviously all of that. You can revisit those teachings. I think they're all out there in some form that you could access. But patience is obviously a very important perfection, a practice that the Bodhisattva engages in. Of course, we all engage in some form of patience at some time in our lives. But here, once more, we're doing it as part of the Bodhisattva's practices. So let's go ahead and get started with my little slideshow that I've put together for tonight. These again are the list of six, and as I am reminding you at the beginning of each of these classes, one thing to point out is that they are set out in terms of the difficulty, with the least difficult being generosity, the most difficult being the practice of wisdom, which obviously, again, we'll get into that much later, a few classes from now, but that's where we have to really do that deeper investigation into the nature of reality. But the first three in particular are very much about kind of our relationship to others and really are rooted in the most fundamental teaching that the Buddha gave, which is the Sanskrit term that's called Ahimsa, non-harmfulness. We spoke about a little bit last week in regard to ethics, but the idea is even with generosity, we're wanting to not harm others in terms of not sharing what we have, our resources, our time, our energy, the ways we can protect others and help others through sharing the Dharma with them. Then, of course, ethics is all about avoiding harming others and engaging in actions that actually benefit them. And then patience is very much the same. Patience is about trying to calm our own minds so that we aren't so easily drawn into conflict with others, as well as difficulties ourselves, exacerbating our own suffering and what have you. So let's go, oops, hit the wrong button there. Didn't want to do that yet. I wanted to go ahead and go on to the next slide. So we're going to talk about patience in regard to four topics tonight. Obviously, a definition that we can start with so we understand what we're talking about in regard to patience. The disadvantages of anger. In each of these perfections, I've been highlighting kind of the hindrances to each of them. And the big hindrance, of course, to patience is the mind of anger, is the mind that is annoyed, upset, even hateful towards others, depending upon what's going on. So we need to talk a little bit about the disadvantages of anger because it is helpful for us to feed into our motivation to practice patience by seeing clearly how anger harms us and harms others. And then the types of patients, there are three types of patients that we'll see, and then the supporting reasons that we use to help develop them, as well as some of the, with regard to the last one, some of the things that we observe and work with in regard to that type of patients. We'll get more into that a little bit later. And then just briefly, the ways to practice this perfection, a little bit of practical advice, as well as just touching on how we want to make our practice very rich by uniting it with the other perfections, what have you. Just touch on that very briefly. So let's go ahead and talk about what we mean by patience. Patience is a virtuous mind that can remain indifferent to any form of harm inflicted by others. That's actually the first type of patience. We'll see that again a little bit later. Can voluntarily endure any form of suffering. That's the second type of patience, because that's not just harm from others, but it's including any type of suffering we have to experience. A headache, difficulty with our computer, whatever. And then lastly, the third type, remain definitely thinking about the Dharma, kind of intending to continue our Dharma practice in a very strong and dedicated way. So it's a virtuous mind that can remain indifferent or remain undisturbed with regard to any of these things that are arising. And sometimes it's just abbreviated to an undisturbed mind, a mind that can be calm and somewhat collected in the space of things happening to us that we don't desire, that are difficult for us. Then, of course, as we've seen with each of these, when it's motivated by bodhicitta, our patience becomes a perfection of patience. This word paramita in the Sanskrit, which means to go beyond, to transcend. These are the ways that we want to work with patience, is always have our bodhicitta motivation as best as we can to bring that perspective in. And as we saw even at the very tail end of last week, remember I introduced at the very end a little quote, I don't know if it was from Rinpoche, I can't remember who it was from, but essentially said, if you have bodhicitta motivation, then your ethical behavior will follow, right? Because if we continually are thinking about benefiting others, well, then how would we harm them? How could we possibly think about harming them? And it's sort of the same with patience. If we have really strong bodhicitta motivation, how can we think about getting angry and upset with other beings? Now, again, one thing I might point out, His Holiness and his teachings on patience, he always talks about how there is a need to certainly have some sort of force to address things that are wrong in our world. And so while we might label that as anger as well, a sort of justifiable anger, when we see injustice, racial injustice, gender injustice, what have you, various things going on in our world that we need to address, but that's not anger, this opposite of patience. We can do those sorts of actions that try to address things in our world with a patient mind, a mind that is not disturbed. And ideally, that's the best way to go about trying to affect change in our world. If we do it with compassion, with great concern for all parties involved, then we will have much better luck and success at addressing issues in our world. So again, this is just to point out that that particular word that we're going to get into shortly when we talk about the disadvantages of anger, there we are talking about the delusion of anger, the mind of anger that is antithetical to a peaceful mind. It is not a mind that's undisturbed at all. So to complete the perfection of patience, Geshe Loden says, one does not have to overcome all enemies and harmful people. This is kind of what we saw also in the previous classes, that these are perfected in our own minds. They're not perfected on the outside. Being a practitioner of patience and perfecting our patience doesn't mean that all enemies disappear outside of you, that there are no longer any people to harm you. He goes on to say, being able to pacify your own uncontrolled mind is the equivalent of pacifying all unruly beings, because then we're no longer agitated by the harmful people and the harmful things that we have to experience, because there are always going to be those in this world. These are the verses from Master Shantideva that I've shared from that one section of chapter 5, where he talks about how each perfection is a mental practice. It does manifest in physical behavior and even, verbal behavior, how we talk and are with others, but it's primarily our own minds. So here's how there's like 3 verses for this. Unruly sentient beings are like space. In other words, space is everywhere. Well, they're everywhere. You can't get away from those unruly sentient beings. All of them cannot possibly be overcome. But if I overcome the mind of anger alone, this will be equivalent to vanquishing all those foes. So again, you don't have to get rid of all the enemies in the outside. You get rid of the mind of anger on the inside, and that essentially doesn't allow them to arise in that form of being an enemy, of being an abuser, because we no longer see them through that lens. Where could I possibly, and he uses this wonderful analogy that I really like, where could I possibly find enough leather with which to cover the surface of the earth? Having leather on just the soles of my shoes is equivalent to covering the earth with it. It's the whole idea that if you think, oh, well, I don't want to ever step on anything sharp or that injures me, therefore I'm going to cover the entire world with something smooth and pliable that I can just walk wherever I want. Well, it's kind of an absurd idea, right? But that's kind of how we go about living our lives. We try to get rid of all the things that will agitate us in the outside world. Oh, I don't like that. Get out of my life. And I don't really care for you. I'll go somewhere else. We do this to kind of smooth out the world around us. But it's much better to smooth out our own minds. Then we can be wherever we need to be. We can be with those unruly people. We can be with whatever situations, and we'll be protected because our mind will remain undisturbed in the face of those situations. It's a much more, well, not just economical solution, rather than putting leather all around the world. Maybe nowadays it would be asphalting the entire world, paving paradise and putting up a parking lot or whatever. But the idea would that we can't fix the outside world so it's all smooth and wonderful and nice and pleasant. We have to change our own minds so we're not agitated by what is not pleasant, what actually gives us some harm or some difficulty. All right, so then we get one more verse, which is taking that analogy back to ourselves. Likewise, it is not possible for me to counteract things externally. But should I counteract this mind of mine, what is the need for counteracting others, right? We don't have to worry about getting rid of these enemies and difficult situations and what have you, because we've adjusted our own minds. Now, it doesn't mean that we still don't strive to overcome our own suffering and what have you, but we don't get bothered by it. We don't get agitated by it in the way that the mind of anger leads us into doing. So let's go ahead and look at the disadvantages of anger. So as I said, a few minutes ago, by anger here, we're talking about the delusion of anger. Anger is a state of mind that arises, and of course, it's one of the three root poisons that the Buddha often speaks of. We essentially have either pleasant experiences that we get quite attached to, or we have unpleasant experiences that we get quite averse to, and we generate a mind of anger or hatred on the basis of the things that are unpleasant. The third of the three poisons, besides attachment and anger, is the root of ignorance that's kind of under the surface of both of those. But essentially, these are the poles that we go back and forth between during every day. We wake up and maybe some things start to go good and we get really attached to it and thinking, oh, wow, my day's going really well. This is great. I want it to keep happening this way. And then something happens that is unpleasant that throws us off track completely. And then we get irritated and annoyed, and we might even do or say things that are not so helpful. And then maybe it smooths out again and our day starts going better again. And so we go back up to that elated place and very attached to that. But then it goes south and we have to deal with the consequences of that. So we end up vacillating between these two extremes in regard to the feelings that we experience, but moreover, our habitual reactions to those feelings. So anger is the way that we are habitually reacting to anything unpleasant in our lives. And it can be, again, in a whole gradation of feelings, everything from like that thing we might call just an aversion or an annoyance, to some irritation, to anger, to hatred, to rage, to all sorts of things in between. I mean, I'm sure there's a number of words in the English language that would fill the gaps between each of those words as well. So we see that there are many different gradations of this, but we are talking about a delusion that is looking at that unpleasant experience and exaggerating the unpleasantness of it and wanting to be separated from it in a way that sees it only through the lens of it being harmful. One of the key things we're going to look at tonight, which is also what we looked at when we did this course, Finding Calm in the Storm, was that these are essentially mind training teachings that we're working with, Lojong, how we change the way our minds are looking at things so we therefore have a different way of responding to them and not reacting to them in our habitual patterns, which again are through anger and aversion and all that kind of energy. So it is important, as I said, that we do see the disadvantages of anger, and sometimes even just seeing that becomes a great impetus to our practice of patience. Oops, hit it twice there. Patience and anger are dichotomies, Rinpoche says. This is, again, I'm quoting from the book on the six perfections that I've encouraged you to read if you would like to, through this course, because he gives his own take on these it's very, very nice. Rinpoche's teachings always on these. So he says that these are dichotomies, that when one is present in our mind, the other cannot be. If we are patient, then anger won't arise. If anger is there, well, then patience is blocked. Therefore, being angry blocks the chance of being patient and is a great hindrance, especially to developing bodhicitta or living one's life in accord with bodhicitta. Because bodhicitta is not a mind that is embracing anger. It's obviously the mind that wants to benefit others. It doesn't want to harm them. And so it's, again, opposed to anger. And so, again, anger and patience and bodhicitta, these can be seen as kind of opposites. Anger is the mind that wishes to harm the other being. That is its function. Of course, we can also have anger arising with regard to inanimate objects, but when we talk about others, it's primarily wanting to harm, wanting to do or say something to put that being in their place, to retaliate against what they've done to us. Bodhicitta, and of course, even the mind of patience that is being discussed here, is the opposite. It doesn't want to harm others. And bodhicitta, it wants to actually help others, wants to benefit others. So, as I was saying earlier, if we have bodhicitta present in the mind, that's also one assurance that we can make sure that we continue to practice patience. Because if every being that we meet, we have that perspective, that it's going to get in the way of our ultimate goal. If we get angry and upset at that person, we're taking several steps backwards rather than going forwards on our path of awakening. But for many of us, that's not going to be enough. Again, we're going to need more antidotes than that. So let's carry on with looking at the disadvantages of anger and gain a deeper appreciation for the role that anger plays in creating suffering for both ourselves and others. The detrimental effects of anger, and this is a list I've put together, and I think a number of these we did touch on in that Finding Calm in the Storm course. It harms our physical health even, as well as obviously our mental peace. People who have a lot of anger in their minds tend to have high blood pressure, have other potential health conflicts that can arise on the basis of having that anger being generated continually. Obstructs your happiness. It seems so strange because when we are in the midst of a situation where we do have that anger arising, we think that that anger is like our guard or our big brother or sister or whoever, somebody who's there to kind of protect us, to make sure that we get the happiness that we're seeking. But it doesn't actually produce happiness. It produces a lot of misery in our own minds and blocks our attainment of happiness. And we know this from our own experience. And nonetheless, we still have anger arising here and there. But it's not a pleasant thing at all to have the mind of anger. It doesn't create any real happiness. We don't feel better after we've had an episode of anger towards someone. So we know that this is one of the disadvantages of anger is it appears to be our best friend, but it's actually our worst enemy. It prevents virtuous thoughts from arising, right? When you have that mind of anger that is so deeply ingrained in our thinking at that time, how can we think about benefiting the other person? How can we think about saying something kind or nice or, trying to break that conflict that we're having with another? Virtuous thoughts are blocked. They just simply won't arise. This is a little quote from Rinpoche in line with what we just talked about. Perhaps we have faith in the Dharma, talking about it often with our friends, but when we are overcome with anger, all that Dharma, all that virtuous thinking is forgotten. What we have learned about karma, refuge, or any of the other subjects seems very far away. Consumed with anger, there's great danger, because virtuous thoughts can't arise. Virtue cannot be there in the midst of a mind consumed with anger. The other, continuing with detrimental effects of anger, the next one causes you to not communicate well. I mean, just recollect the times that you've had an episode of getting angry and upset with somebody. If somebody was recording it and they played back what you said, you would be just embarrassed the way that you were talking and the things that you were saying, and you were probably not saying things clearly. You were saying things purely from an emotional standpoint, and we just don't communicate well. That's why often if there's a conflict going on, it's best to say, I think we're kind of escalating things here. Let's take a little break and come back and talk about things in a way where we're much more calm and collected. But this is the challenge. When you're in the midst of that anger, that's not what the thoughts that even potentially arise. You usually just want to keep seeing it through because you think eventually you're going to be the victor in that situation. But in the midst of that, we really haven't done anything to help ourselves or to help others due to that arising of that anger. And in the process, we've probably again said a lot of things, maybe even done a lot of things that we could have done a lot better. hinders the resolution of problematic situations. How many things go on and on and on and just fester because we just keep going back to the mind of anger every time that we are with that person or think about that person. And we don't have any resolution if we stay in that mind of anger. Some people carry around anger. The analogy that you've probably heard that is frequently used is the idea of carrying around a hot coal, waiting to throw it at the person who was the offender, the person who harmed you. Well, who gets burned in the process of that? You do, but you never resolve the situation because you're always carrying around that hot coal. The minute you see them or think of them, it just keeps burning away and making it, harder and harder for you to reconcile, to ever forgive them, to ever have any sort of renewal of the relationship, if that's something you desire. The third on this screen diminishes your discrimination, resulting in doing and saying things you regret. This is kind of similar to the not communicating well, but this is more from the mental side. We don't discriminate very well when the mind of anger is present. And we, throw things out or say things or do things that, again, are not in line with any sort of wisdom. The mind of discrimination that actually can think about how to best resolve situations and how to move forward and what have you is not present. We end up doing a lot of things that we regret. So these three all kind of fit together to some degree. They just the situation just keeps getting exacerbated. It doesn't really resolve. And that's because we're not in a position to think or communicate well. It damages relationships and causes others to shun or isolate you. I mean, I would hope that all of you have never had that situation where you've had a whole relationship, maybe of many, many years, maybe even with family members, where it just completely went south. But it happens, and perhaps it has happened to us. We can see how much the mind of anger damages relationships, and maybe see how it can be from the other person's side as well as our own side. But from our own side, we need to take responsibility for that and recognize how much it causes others to shun us, to isolate us, to not want to be with us. And then if we carry that over from year to year throughout our lives, it fosters even greater bitterness and resentment because we just never again get a chance to heal from that. Instead, we continue to have these lingering feelings based on damage that has occurred to relationships and so on. Physically, it said that it makes you appear unattractive. Again, if you had that video camera or somebody there with a camera taking a snapshot of you at that time, you probably wouldn't think you look attractive at all, right? You got this red face and bulging eyes and really, not looking so good. In fact, one of the karmic consequences, they say, of the mind of anger is that it leads you to have a not so attractive appearance in future existences. Patience, on the other hand, leads to having a beautiful form, having people find you very pleasing. So it's kind of the physical manifestation. But as I said, even in the moment, we know that that's what's going on. We've seen other people angry. When we see them and what they look like and how they're manifesting, we know that we're the same. We don't look pretty when we're dealing with the mind of anger. Carrying on to the next one, it destroys your merit or positive potential. This is one of the main things, actually, the beginning of chapter 6 of Shantideva's text that I think all of you have studied before. And there is another book by Lama Zopa that was released not too long ago on that chapter specifically. The book is called Patience. And then, of course, His Holiness has commentary on it. But one of the first things they say is that having a mind of anger, especially towards a bodhisattva, results in unbelievable destruction of merit. That, all this merit you've created over many, many eons can be burned up in an instant. Well, we don't have to necessarily, we won't have a proof of that. I can't show that to you and say, oh, here's your merit that got consumed when you got angry at this person or what have you. But as I said, we know that what happens to relationships when we have that moment of anger. Sometimes it's like all the goodwill and everything that led you to be such good friends and companions in this life is burnt up. It's just gone because that mind of anger that one or both of you got carried away with ended up destroying everything. So we see that even in those terms, there's great destruction. But when we talk about all of our other positive potential we've created, we obviously don't want that to be burnt up in a moment of anger. So it is important, because we don't know who are bodhisattvas and who are Buddhas even, it's important that we refrain from having anger as much as we can towards anybody. But obviously, again, it's much more powerful if we have an object such as our gurus, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, beings who are very powerful for us. And it produces unfavorable karmic results. The mind of anger does, it's sort of the primary force behind what we know of as the hell realms, the realms of great suffering that the Buddha described, that we may not have complete confidence in, but we can imagine that there must be some sorts of karmic consequences from following that mind of anger and perpetuating it in our minds. So there are definitely very destructive results that we can have from the karma we create when we have the mind of anger. Then Rinpoche talks a little bit about this idea of how destructive it can be. He says, along with heresy, heresy, by this he means like having really wrong views and turning away from the Dharma and what the Dharma teaches, and even from teachers. Anger is considered the most damaging mind to have, in that it destroys any undedicated merit. Just as grain that is completely burned in a fire can never sprout into the plant, any positive merit we have can never ripen into a positive result when burned by anger or, again, heresy, wrong view. Merit that has been dedicated, he says, will not be completely burned, but the result will still be disturbed. For instance, it may become impossible to experience the result of our dedicated merit for 1,000 eons, so we might end up consuming all of that. Now, again, he's mostly talking about this anger towards a high being, a bodhisattva and what have you. And that's where the texts are very clear that it's mostly those situations where great amounts of our merit is burnt up or blocked from creating the result that we seek if it's been dedicated, like Rinpoche says. But essentially, we shouldn't take risks at any of this. And when we hear these sorts of disadvantages, we should think, wow, well, that's pretty heavy consequences if I follow the mind of anger. Best for me to be patient, best for me to do whatever I can to sort of change the situation or change my mind, of course, the big thing. Whoops. And he says, all our realizations on the path, even our temporal happiness, will be delayed for that incredible length of time. So all of what we're seeking, and by our dedication of merit and that, producing this path to enlightenment and our eventual attainment of that state, can get delayed for a great amount of time if we aren't careful, again, in who we're having anger towards and the consequences of that. So let's go on then to talk about the types of patients and their supporting reasons. I might mention to you that besides the slides, which I'm going to be sharing again with all of you, so that'll go out. Thank you, Sarah, for sending those out every week. I'm also going to have this little handout that's called The Mind of Patients. And this is where you'll see all of these as well. I'm kind of repeating things that are on this sheet in my slides because I find it a little bit easier to work with the slides on the screen than all of these bullet points. But just know that you have a handout, you'll be getting a handout that has one side is the types of patients, these three that we're going to go through. And then the other one is the ways to practice patience for the best and purest results, which again, I'll touch on a little bit at the tail end of tonight. But I just wanted to, point that out, that you're not missing anything that's on those handouts through the slides. Instead, I'm just going to be using the slides because, again, it's a little bit easier going bit by bit. These are the three types of patients, which, as I said, were mentioned in the definition or the description of the perfection of patience, because these are all three ways that someone who is on the Bodhisattva path wants to remain undisturbed in the face of, first, harm that is inflicted by others. We do receive harm from other beings, and that is one of the main sources of harm that we experience in this world. So we have to have this indifference, this undisturbed mind in the face of that. Secondly, voluntarily enduring the suffering that we have that is just part and parcel of being a sentient being. The suffering of aging, the suffering of illness, the suffering of being separated from the things we like, what have you. All of these various things that we experience that are part of a samsaric existence. We have to be able to endure them and not get so agitated by them. We might not harm somebody else from that second one, but we're going to harm ourselves if we're continually just rallying against everything that appears to be suffering and not using it in a constructive way, which, as I said, is kind of the Lojong approach, the mind training approach. Thirdly, the patience of definitely thinking about the Dharma, kind of keeping our minds to gaining certainty about the Dharma through investigating the Dharma, without being sort of irritated or annoyed by the challenges that we might face, the hardships we might have to endure in our practice of the Dharma. So the first one is described as to restrain from retaliating towards those who harm us and to become compassionate towards them instead. Kind of similar to what we saw with regard to the virtuous actions last week when we looked at the practice of ethics. We're not just talking about not getting angry or upset. I mean, that's a first step. But can we even go to the complete opposite mind, which is having compassion for them in the midst of this? They say that the bodhisattva who has developed the perfection of patience to a surpassing degree, the analogy that's used, I don't know if we can even imagine such a thing, but if on one side there's somebody who is like lovingly massaging their right arm, and then on the other side you have somebody who is like hacking away at their left arm with a machete or something, that they would have a completely patient mind that would have no anger towards the person who is harming them, and in fact have only compassion. So we're talking about, again, not just refraining from having anger that be present in our minds, but going to the opposite state of mind where we actually have compassion and concern for that well-being. And of course, that's based in some understandings about what that being is involved in, what they are doing in the things that they are causing us to experience, the harm they are giving us. When we have that understanding, then it's more natural for compassion to generate if we actually think about it than it should be for anger to be generated. So there are a number of, again, these sorts of reasons that influence this. We'll get into those in a moment. First, I want to share a little bit from Rinpoche. He says, how we view a situation depends entirely on our mind. Viewed one way, the person wanting to harm us is an enemy, and the action is a harmful one. Viewed another way, that person is actually a friend, and their action is helpful. So this is like pure mind training stuff, right? This is pure Lojong. All of you have had Lojong teachings, I'm sure, and know that there is this idea of sort of changing how we are looking at things. When somebody is displaying harm towards us, we can actually see them, as it's said in the 8 verses of Training the Mind, as our most precious guru, as our best teacher. Thank you for teaching me how to be patient, how to not react in my habitual ways of anger and what have you towards someone who's harming me. And we actually need those teachers in our lives. If we think about it, and again, it might be different in everyone's situation, and there might be those rare people in the world who have nothing but people who irritate and annoy them in their lives. But for most of us, the larger portion of beings in our lives are actually pretty kind and considerate. They're not saying mean things to us and trying to destroy us at every corner or what have you. Generally, people are pretty kind and beneficial for us. Well, those people don't help you practice patience generally. I know sometimes people tell me, well, but the person you're actually closest to can help you to practice patience the best. And there is some truth to that, because the proximity they have to you, the way they know you, and the way they know how to get your goat, can be really challenging at times. Intimate relationships often do lead to that opportunity to practice patience, because the other person does know a lot about us and know how to get to us. But we really do need these difficult people in our lives, because most people in our lives, probably for most of us, are not causing us all kinds of consternation and problems and difficulty and saying horrible things to us and what have you. And that rare person that comes along that is doing that, we go, oh, there's my most precious friend. They're going to be of so much benefit to me. Not that we want them to do harmful things to us, because that's not good for them. But as long as they're going to do it, let's use it for advantage, and for the advantage of not just ourselves or even other beings, but even for their advantage. Because if what they're doing in harming us actually becomes the cause for us to become more patient, to perfect our patience and become a Buddha, well, then we'll be able to benefit them. In fact, it's often said that having any kind of contact with beings is better than no contact at all. So even if you're having a harmful contact with somebody, at least you're making a karmic connection with them. And if you're practicing patience and not anger while they are harming you, well, then you're creating a really kind of interesting karma where it's like you really are wanting to benefit them in the future because you're so moved in seeing the ways that they're suffering as they're trying to harm you or doing things that are, difficult for you. So this is the first part of this, is just to look at how, Rinpoche is putting it out there. We have a choice. We can frame this one way and just see it in our habitual way of, oh, this is a horrible, nasty, awful person. This is the worst problem I've ever had, and they're such an idiot, and blah, 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 blah. And follow that whole train of thought. Or we can go, this is great. This is exactly what I need. Thank you. You're my most precious guru. And we don't just say that to them, but we can do that on the inside so that we then use that situation to best advantage for everyone involved. So Rinpoche says it's like having the choice to switch channels on our TV to a violent movie or a gentle one. Now, just as our mind is the door to all suffering, it is also the door to all happiness, depending on how we use it. Because present happiness and present suffering depend on what attitude we have, we must constantly watch our mind, always keeping it virtuous. Then we won't be looking at what we're experiencing necessarily as suffering. It'll initially appear in that way, but we'll be able to transform it. And this is what Lojong is all about, transforming our thoughts so that at the time when we are experiencing something that we would normally label as suffering, and that person we'd normally label as enemy, we change it. They become our most precious friend, and we're not going to see it as suffering at all, but rather something that will benefit us. Okay, let's go into some of the reasons that are set out on the chart that, again, you'll get tomorrow or they're not tomorrow, in the next few days that you can work with. First of all, we want to hold the reasoning that the harm doers, the person who is causing us harm or difficulty, they're utterly without self-control. So anger is inappropriate. We often use this phrase that beings are under the control of their karma and their delusions. And for most beings, well, ourselves included, we are still under the control of them, but we at least have the awareness that these things are factors that we have to experience and have to kind of rail against and not always fall prey to. But most beings don't have any idea. They're kind of programmed by their past karma to think and act in particular ways, and they are under the control of those. This is why Venerable Rabina, sometimes when she talks about, people bring up the issue of free will, and she says, well, in her estimation, in Buddhist terms, we don't really have free will per se, because so much of what we do and think, at least for most beings, is under the control of our past actions and our past karma and delusions that we've had, that we've gotten very habituated towards. But we'd have to put a footnote on that, though, because there is still the ability, whether we call it free will or not, the ability to choose to do something different. But we have to acquire that. You have to work with that. Most beings don't have that. So that person who's accosting you in the parking lot, or the person who's, a coworker who just keeps saying negative things to you, they don't have that control. They don't even know about that control, probably. They're people who have, again, just gotten acclimated to ways of thinking and acting that are not beneficial for themselves or for others. They're harming us because they're under the control of those factors. Well, then our anger isn't really appropriate, is it? They use the example sometimes of, like, if your own dear mother or someone very close to you, if they were taking a medication that made them mentally unstable to where they were just yelling and, saying really mean things all the time, but you knew that that wasn't kind of who they were at the core of their being. You're like, oh, well, that's not really mom. Mom is just acting that way because she's under the control of this weird medicine that makes her say and do these things. Well, it's kind of like that with beings. At the very core of their being, there's goodness. This is what Buddha nature essentially is all about, is that when we get down to that fundamental level of what the mind is, it's pure, it's wholesome, it has all of these qualities that are resonant with it. Hatred and all the other delusions are there adventitiously. They're only there because people have never addressed getting rid of them. We ourselves are trying to engage in that process through our Buddhist practice. But most beings, again, don't even have that awareness, and they don't have the tools to do that. So anger is totally inappropriate because these beings are under the control of other factors. We won't say again that it's their absolute nature. We're going to look at that shortly. But the idea is that this is definitely something that is playing a role. So they don't have any self-control. They don't really have the ability to choose to do otherwise. And here's where we look at it, this idea of, is it in their nature to actually do harm? If the fault of doing harm is inherent to them, it's something that is actually in the nature of those beings that are harm doers. Well, anger is not correct in that situation. Why? It would be like being angry at fire for burning, right? Because if it's actually in their nature, well, then there's absolutely zero control over it. They have no way of being able to ever change that. So why should we get angry and upset at them? Because it's just their nature. Of course, in Buddhist terms, you wouldn't say that it is their nature. But as I was just pointing out, it's almost as if it's their nature, simply because they've never been introduced to the teachings that help them to see that they can act otherwise. So these harm doers continue to do harm in a sense because that is their not nature that's inherent, but it is a nature that they acquire from previous lifetimes, and therefore they act in that way. So it'd be like getting angry at fire because it burns. That's just the nature of fire. Now, if on the other hand, the fault of doing harm is adventitious, which of course is what Buddhism teaches, that there's an adventitious quality, meaning that again, it's there and beings do that, but only because they haven't addressed it. It's not in their actual nature, but it's how they are manifesting at the moment. Well, then anger's also not correct. Why? Because those temporary flaws are there that are arising. It's sort of like being angry at the sky for having smoke in it or clouds in it or whatever. You get up in the morning and you see all these clouds, and it's not you wanted a sunny day, and you're like angry at the sky for having all these clouds in it. Well, again, these are just there adventitiously. The clouds will eventually, blow away or dissipate through the heat of the sun or whatever the case might be. So again, if it's a temporary flaw, if it's something that is only there adventitiously, there's not a lot of logic in getting upset at it because it's not the essence of that being. It's not the nature of that being. It's only there adventitiously. So it's kind of a corollary to what we saw in that first reason. But even if it was their nature, even if we were to go to some place where we say somebody is like inherently evil, inherently, harmful to others, well, then why would you get upset at them if that's their actual nature? That said, it's like getting angry at the fire for burning things. Well, that's the nature of fire. What do you expect it to do? It burns. What do you expect the person who has anger as their nature to do? To get upset, to want to harm others. So once more, we can use this type of logic to begin to see the other person through a different lens. See that actually they are under the control of factors that, of course, aren't there in terms of being their fundamental nature, but they are there adventitiously. And moreover, these beings simply don't have the wherewithal to address those things in their lives and in their own minds. And look at how hard it is for us to address our own stuff, right? Each of us trying to practice this path of patience and try to be calmer around the people who agitate us and annoy us. We've got some inkling of what to do, right? That's what we're doing tonight and reviewing many of these techniques for most of you, as well as introducing perhaps some new techniques. But this is what we're trying to practice, and it's such an uphill battle. My gosh, you just have to day in and day out work with continually reminding yourself of these things, meditating on them, working with them, trying to keep them at the forefront of your mind so that you don't, keep stepping in it. That's our own situation. What is it like for all these beings who have no clue, who have no kind of inkling that they can change their minds, that they can work on this, that this isn't in their nature? I mean, I do hear people say that, I'm just an angry person. That's just the way I am, right? That's kind of falling into that first possibility, thinking it's my nature. I was born this way. I'm born, with a red face and angry and upset at the world from the moment I came out of the womb. Well, that isn't really what happens, but nonetheless, people do feel that way. They feel it's just such a part of their persona and who they are that it's as if it is inherent to them. But either way, it doesn't make sense to get angry at them, to have anger ourselves towards others who are manifesting in that way. Because as we saw, it's comparable to getting angry at fire for burning or at the sky for having clouds in it or smoke in it. And a third point for reflection, another reason why it's not right to have anger towards those who inflict harm. Since the person is being wielded by their hostility, and that's why they're harming us, it is wrong to be angry at them, just as you wouldn't be angry at the stick being wielded by the person who hits you with it. This comes directly from Master Shantideva's 6th chapter. He uses the example of, if somebody is wailing on you with a stick, well, you don't get angry at the stick, right? Somebody said, well, why aren't you angry at the stick? The stick is what's hitting your body, actually causing the harm, where it's hitting your head. Well, you say, but the stick is being wielded by the person. And Shantideva's reply is, but the person's being wielded by their hostility, by their anger, by their troubled, crazy mind. So this is kind of all in the same vein of looking at it from the point of view of beings are not under self-control. They're not able to take charge of their own minds and do what they need to do to contain themselves, to keep from harming others, because they're being wielded by these crazy delusions that we ourselves are struggling with. Again, we can have an empathy because we understand how difficult it is when you're under the control of hostility, anger, rage, what have you. So again, gives us a little more space for an understanding of why it's not so good to have anger, but moreover, why it's appropriate to have compassion. Because compassion makes complete sense in a situation like that. Here's this poor being who's being wielded by their anger, by their own hostility. Another reason, harm doers are impelled to do harm to you by the power of your karma. I know this gets to be a really challenging one for people because everybody goes, what, you're telling me it's my fault that this person is harming me? Well, again, I don't like using words like fault or saying, oh, you deserve it. I mean, these are not really the way that karma should be approached. It's a simple explanation of cause and effect. Why do weeds grow up in our garden and what have you? Because we don't take the time to go out and pull the weeds. Why are there certain things in our lives? Because we haven't done what is appropriate to circumvent those things being in our lives. It doesn't make us a horrible person. We shouldn't feel guilty about it. We should simply take responsibility and say, okay, I sowed these seeds. They've ripened into these beings doing harm to me. I'll take responsibility and acknowledge I'm party to that. It doesn't mean the other person isn't doing what they're doing. They're engaging in those harmful actions. Again, impelled by their own anger and hostility and what have you, all of that. But why are we on the receiving end? We must have done something, that is, and actually Rinpoche does point it out here and other teachings he's given that is really quite personal. Venerable Rabina and I had this discussion one time when I took her down to the prison in Santa Rosa for a visit so she could see some of the guys down there and give vows and what have you. But she said, oh, Don, what do you think about this whole thing of whether karma is that personal, where it's like if you're being harmed by so-and-so, that person, that you must have actually harmed them in the past, as opposed to just having harmed beings in general, and then they're just the agent of those beings that is, causing harm to you. But Rinpoche does say that it actually is something quite that personal, that you must have harmed that being, and that's why you've got that karmic connection with that being inflicting harm on you. Well, then again, if that is part of the setup, and we'll just use it as a hypothesis, if that's part of the setup, that why I have that being harming me is because I've harmed them, well, again, it doesn't mean they're totally absolved of whatever they do, because they still have the karmic consequences of what they do. But we are in the equation because of what we did. So who, if we want to use these words like blame, who is to blame? It's a joint thing. We created that karma together with that being. It's now manifesting in the form of us being harmed by them. And the last time we had an interaction, I must have been harming them, or else I wouldn't be receiving that. So if I simply take responsibility, as I said, not look at it as some sort of guilt trip and I feel horrible because I must have been a really awful person creating such horrible karma to have this person in my life. No, it just means that we say this is a simple process of cause and effect. I created the causes. Now I'm experiencing the effects. I just have to clean up my act, pay attention to what are the things that get you into that. And the reality is what's going to get you into the same situation is being angry and upset at that person who's harming you, because then you keep that energy going. You harmed them the last time, now they're harming you, and then you harm them, and then they harm you, and you just keep, escalating the whole situation. We see this happening in individuals as well as even in countries, parts of the world. And this is part of the equation too. When we look at this reasoning, if you do have anger in that moment when someone is harming you, you would be failing to bear slight suffering in the present and instead creating the causes of suffering in the future, which is actually quite contradictory. If your motivation is, I can't bear to suffer, well, then you're inflicting harm on that being who's harming you, or yelling at them, or doing whatever you think is necessary, is actually antithetical to your not suffering. This is all rooted once more in the teachings on karma, that whatever we do, through our thoughts, through our verbal actions, our speech, through our physical actions, all of that creates a cause that will then ripen into a future effect. So if that person is harming us, we have the mind of anger because we can't bear that suffering. We're like, say all sorts of mean, horrible things and maybe even hit them in the face so they get out of our life at that time and stop causing us suffering. We're doing that because we don't want to suffer in the moment, but we're creating the causes for unbelievable suffering in the future. It doesn't make sense. It's not logical. But of course, most beings don't have a perspective of things beyond this life or even beyond the moment of this life. And they make decisions in the heat of the moment and do something thinking it's totally appropriate to do that. But they don't see the karmic consequences. So if we keep in mind the karmic consequences of our own anger, why would we create the causes for our future suffering when we don't want to suffer in the moment? Better to bear that suffering, to actually even, as I said, generate compassion for that being. And then we create a totally different karma. Right? Create the karma for happiness, for well-being, for no future conflict with that person. Whoops, went twice. This is another interesting one that Shantideva points out. Since you have the basis for being harmed, whether it be your own physical body that's being harmed or your own tender ego that's being harmed by, what somebody's saying to you that insults you, for example, anger is unjustified because you've set up the target in a sense. And this is a hard one for us to get sometimes because we think, well, I mean, all I've got is this physical body that, somebody's inflicting harm upon, or, or this mind that they're damaging through their harsh words or whatever that they're saying to me. Well, we've created these bases through our own karmic actions. As all of you know in the teachings on karma, one of the main results is the specific rebirth that we take. This human rebirth, we've got these wonderful human bodies, but there is a lot of, it's the word, vulnerability to this body, right? So we can be harmed in many ways with this body. And then we have these minds that are so, vulnerable as well, that are just very tender, and we hear just the slightest thing and we get upset. Well, in a sense, we've set up the target. We've set up something that can be wounded physically and mentally. Again, I'm not trying to, through this, make you feel bad about yourself or anything, but recognize that these, again, to some degree, still involve some choice of how we look at this. Even though we do have this vulnerable body and vulnerable mind, it doesn't mean that we have to always see ourselves as the victim then of whatever, arrows of, are flung at us, whatever sorts of things we have to experience. But Shantideva does use this as one of the reasonings, that we can say, well, who created this body that is harmed by others? Or who created this mind that is bent out of shape by what others say or do? We are the creators of this. We determine, what we have. And in that way, once more, we can take some sort of karmic responsibility. Let's go on to look at the next one. Since you are committed to the happiness of all beings, including those harm doers, it is inappropriate to have anger towards them. This once more goes back to our bodhicitta motivation. If you are committed to all beings finding happiness and helping them to achieve that, and all beings being free from suffering, and you're protecting them from that suffering, well, then why would you have anger towards them? Your anger doesn't make any sense if that's what your commitment is. So if you've taken the bodhisattva vows, or even just generated bodhicitta as part of your practice in this Mahayana path, the heart of it is to not do harm to others, to not have anger towards them. And it's towards all beings. While those who we consider enemies might be the most challenging to work with, they are part of that objective field that we are generating bodhicitta towards, that we are generating loving kindness and compassion towards. Let's go on to the second one. This is the patience of voluntarily enduring suffering. So by the way, as I go through all of these, both this first one and second one, we've looked at a number of the reasons. And I think I mentioned this when we went through finding calm in the storm as well. Some of these reasons may be more salient for some of you than others are. You might look at it and go, wow, I never thought of it that way, but that's a really effective way to think about it. Well, then begin meditating on that so that when you have your next situation, maybe next week during the holidays, you get together with that person who is that thorn in your side, and you've got something that you can work with, a tool in your utility belt that you can kind of pull out and say, oh, I know how to work with this. When this person's saying these things to me and doing these things that I find really annoying, I'm going to try to think of them in that lens, through that way of understanding it, and see what effects you have. And you're not going to have immediate, complete quelling of all of your anger. Don't expect that. This is a process. I was going to say this towards the end when we talk about how we practice this, but know that we should generally start with the things that are really minor irritations in our life. Don't say, oh, I'm going to work with the most annoying person I have and I'm going to really get patient with them. There's some benefit to kind of working with that, because if you do develop your skills with that person, then you'll probably have it for everybody else really easily. But I think it's easier if we start working with the little things. I don't like the way that guy clicks his teeth, or I don't like the way that, that this person decorates their home, or, whatever. We find all these things that we find annoying about others that they are continually putting in our face and trying to, annoy us with it. Or maybe they're not even intending to annoy us, but we get annoyed by it. Well, work with the little things that annoy you. And then you gain some confidence that you can actually change your mind in the space of those. And eventually you can be with the most difficult people and those who harm you the greatest. And you can remain calm and patient. So anyway, that's just a little footnote to this as we go through these reasons, because the second one, we're also going to see a number of reasons that help us to practice voluntarily enduring whatever suffering we have to experience, which, as it's described here, as the capacity to happily take on any form of suffering or difficulty and turn it into the path to enlightenment. This is, once more, is a real mind training technique. I'm going to transform my suffering into happiness, not in the moment that I'm going to always be like, elated, but I'm going to make it a cause to help me move towards greater happiness for both myself and others by transforming it into something that is a part of the path. So Rinpoche describes this in the following way. He says, the second of the three types of patience is the patience of voluntarily accepting suffering. When we reflect deeply on our life, we will see how while we remain in this unenlightened state, it is not only unavoidable to experience suffering, but also completely natural. Right? What's the song? I think it was Dolly Parton, right? I beg your pardon. No, it's a Loretta Lynn. I beg your pardon. I never promised you a rose garden. Well, life is like that. Who promised you a rose garden? Do you get that guarantee when you come out of the womb that you're going to have just a rose garden for the duration of your life? There's no guarantee for that. None of us have that guarantee that our life is going to be cushy and wonderful and free of all suffering. In fact, it's part and parcel of what we mean by samsaric existence. And we've all studied the Four Noble Truths, the very first truth, the truth of dukkha, or suffering, that it's unsatisfactory. Why do we have the expectation that everything should be great? Venerable Rabina talks about how she always gets that question about why do bad things happen to people? Why do I have to experience all this horrible suffering? But they never ask, why do good things happen to me, right? Because that's our default mode, is we think the good things are all supposed to happen to us. Life is supposed to be cushy. I'm supposed to be well all the time. I'm not supposed to be dealing with this aging body that gets more difficult and painful, as years go on. These are the sorts of thoughts that we carry with us. And so then we get really bent out of shape when we have to experience any form of suffering, be it the suffering of aging or the suffering of not having what we want, and so on, all these various types of suffering that the Buddha set out. So this second type is where we are again having to first confront that inevitability that we will experience suffering in this life. The unpleasant things are going to come, even if you are in the most powerful position and the richest person on the planet. It's still going to come in the form of some level of suffering that you have to experience. we should see that the nature of whatever we experience with our unsubdued mind is only suffering, regardless of whether it is a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling. Of course, this is the deeper understanding that is in the Four Noble Truths, where we see that even our pleasant experiences are unsatisfactory to some degree. But mostly what we're working with in this second type of patience is what we identify as unpleasant, what we identify as something that we have to endure. That is, again, part and parcel of life in samsara. Here, the reasons are the following. The first one, because suffering occurs continually, and that which is produced by your former karma cannot be dispelled, you must know how to bring it into the path. Otherwise, you either generate hostility or potentially even become discouraged and thus create interferences with applying yourself to virtue. So this is the first sort of logic that sets the stage for what we're going to do in the remaining reasons, is that because suffering is part of life, we don't want it to become a cause for us to have further hostility, to generate anger, to get upset, to be somebody who's continually upset at all the problems and difficulties of life. And we also don't want it to make us discouraged or depressed, right? Because there's no benefit to that. The Buddha didn't teach the First Noble Truth so he could depress everyone on the planet. He taught the First Noble Truth so you could awaken to that reality, not be so alarmed at it and concerned about it in the moment so that you don't accept that it's part of samsara, but then you put the energy into the path that will move away from that. Suffering plays a role in terms of being able to help us to practice the path to enlightenment if we use it in that way. So this, once more, is a mind training technique where we're going to reframe how we look at it. Rather than suffering being, oh, it just makes me angry, all the shit I have to deal with every day or something, pardon my French there, but, or, the depression where we go, oh God, this is just so horrible to be alive. I mean, I just want to shoot myself or something. That neither of those responses are a healthy response to the reality of suffering in our lives. The healthiest response is to say, there's suffering in my life. I need to use this well. I need to make sure that I actually contemplate some of the teachings on the stages of the path that pertain to that suffering. And of course, one of them is just that reality of suffering itself being indicative of what we're involved in. And therefore, we have to turn away from that and move towards liberation and so on. But we'll get into those in just a moment. So the idea here, again, is that we have to apply ourselves to virtue in the midst of our suffering, and eventually even begin to like those experiences of suffering, because once more, they help us to continually improve the quality of our own minds. There's that wonderful quote from, this is a paraphrase of it, from Master Shantideva's 6th chapter as well, verse 10. If you can remedy a situation in which suffering occurs, there's no need for dejection, right? You just put your energy into fixing it. If you cannot remedy it, well, then the dejection, the depression, whatever, is useless. Anything that we look at that occurs to us in our life, let's take aging, which we are all dealing with, whatever age we are, we still have that process of aging that is unfolding every second of this life. Well, is that something you can do something about? Well, maybe you can take a medicine or make sure you have certain vitamins that maybe curtail a little bit of that. But the reality is we are all on this march towards old age, if we make it that far, and then eventually towards death. Well, that's a reality of life. It's not much I can do about it. So getting dejected about it seems kind of preposterous, because it's a reality I have to accept. And trying to change it, if we can't change it, doesn't really make a lot of sense. So we have to analyze, is it something I can change? If it is, well, then let me put the energy into changing it. But if it's something I can't change, well, then getting all depressed and dejected and angry and upset doesn't really make much sense, because it's a reality that I have to accept. And once more, if we consider that this is what we've created karmically, not only have we created this wonderful human existence that is so rich in opportunity, but it's a human body that we're living in that does go through all that process of aging and illness and what have you. So we have to kind of accept it all, take it all in as something that we can't do much about. We might be able to, again, change some minor things, but we can't really remedy the fundamental situation that we're in. So when we look at suffering, these are, again, things that I did cover previously in that Finding Calm in the Storm. I touched on them in various ways. It does have these good qualities. First, as I alluded to just a few minutes ago, it spurs you on to liberation. Why? Because if you see that first noble truth really clearly, the whole purpose why the Buddha taught it is so that you then, of course, examine the causes of that and seek liberation, seek a cessation of dukkha, an end to your suffering once and for all. It helps you to generate what we call renunciation, the turning away from the habitual patterns we've been involved in samsara and turning towards nirvana, the state of peace that we all can attain. It dispels your arrogance, kind of diminishes any pride that we might have. Yeah, well, we look at your own experiences with suffering in this life. When some things have happened to you, you kind of go, oh, wow, I guess I'm subject to that. I kind of had this prideful mind that thought somehow I was above that, beyond that. Well, I was never going to experience that. I wasn't ever going to get cancer. I wasn't ever going to have, somebody do this to me or whatever. I mean, any of these harms we experience, any of the suffering we experience, it can greatly diminish our pride and that inflated sense that we have that somehow, I don't know, we've transcended that. Well, guess what, folks? We haven't. If you've attained liberation, then you've created the cessation of all of your suffering. If you haven't, well, then you have to work on that. Better not to be so prideful and think that somehow, we've managed to rise above the fray. So it kind of keeps us in check in regard to our own prideful mind. A third benefit or good quality is it causes you to shun non-virtue. Why? Because any suffering we experience, any difficulty we have, whether it be the harm from others that we talked about earlier, or the suffering of being parted from things, having people steal from you, for example, what have you, anything that you experience, or losing resources to natural disasters, anything you experience that is painful, difficult, suffering, labeled that way, is a product of non-virtue. Fourth one, it causes you to embrace cultivating virtue, because virtue will result in happiness. Again, we shouldn't get so attached to having these samsaric experiences of happiness, but we should recognize that the reason why we're experiencing the suffering of being separated from things or what have you, all these various things, is due to our own negative karma, that we've created those results. And if we want to avoid those, then we need to be more dedicated to the path of virtue. Then number 5, of course, it has the ability, if we take it to another dimension, of producing compassion for those who wander in psychic existence like ourselves. And an example of that is where we use Tonglen, which most of you are familiar with, taking others' suffering and giving them happiness. When we see that we are experiencing anything, Rinpoche often encourages this to be just the very basic way that we practice Tonglen. Say you get up one day and you have a really bad headache or something happening to you physically. There's no one to get angry at, but rather than getting angry and upset that that's happening to you, identify with others who are suffering at that time. And if you can hold the thought, and this is all that Rinpoche asks you to do, he doesn't say I mean, eventually we want to say, could I take on all of their headaches and have this massive headache that would get rid of all of theirs, because I don't want them to have this headache. But even if you just hold the thought, through my having this headache and being able to endure it, may others not have it. You don't have to think about piling that all on top of yourself. Even just the thought that your endurance of it, you're tolerating it, you're being patient in the face of that suffering. May others not have to suffer in that way. That's already extending your compassion, right? It gets you out of your own little miserable bubble of me and what's happening to me at this time. Again, that's how that impatience, that anger can sometimes manifest. We get really upset thinking, why me? Well, we've looked at some of the reasoning why that happens to us. But let's use it as a doorway to connect with the suffering of others. That's what Tonglen is all about. And you can practice Tonglen in a variety of ways. But as I said, Rinpoche's sort of bare minimum is at least think, through my having to have this headache or this stomach ache or having my, car damaged by hail or whatever the case may be, whatever suffering you have to experience, whatever difficulty you have, may others not experience it. May somehow that become a cause for them to not have that pain, that agony in their lives. It's already kind of takes us out of our own stuff and helps us to generate that compassionate wish. And we can use whatever suffering we experience as a doorway to connect with the suffering of others, because that's what it's all about, to really keep our hearts open to the reality that we're not alone. We're not the sole person on the planet who's suffering. We're all going through, our own stuff. The third one doesn't have these sorts of reasons behind it, but this one's called the patience of definitely thinking about the Dharma, which is described here as an attitude willing to constantly listen to, think about, and meditate on the Dharma. So those are the three sort of wisdoms we often talk about: the wisdom of hearing or listening to the Dharma, which can also be reading, taking the Dharma in; the wisdom of thinking or reflecting on the Dharma. That's the process we go through by digesting these teachings. And what we call our analytical meditation is mostly that, our sitting on the cushion and thinking about these teachings that we've received. And eventually to meditate at an even deeper level with a much more stable mind on the Dharma, so it actually changes our mind. We have to do this constantly. We have to have a real commitment and dedication. And it's interesting that we're going to see in the next perfection that we'll do in 2 weeks when we return after the Thanksgiving holiday. But this could be kind of a corollary to that perfection of kind of joyous enthusiasm and perseverance in our practice. But here it's labeled as a patience that we want to cultivate. Why? Because I think we do sometimes have that kind of impatient quality when we're working with the Dharma. Maybe sometimes we even become impatient with ourselves and our inability to integrate the Dharma as well as we'd like, and to be as mindful in the ways that we go about living our lives and what have you. Sometimes we become our own worst enemy through that type of impatience in the face of trying to practice the Dharma. But the orientation here is really to have that sort of steadfastness that's able to continue to be enthusiastic to some degree. So you do have kind of those qualities of the next perfection of enthusiasm or joyous effort, but also that you don't let those things kind of become sources of irritation or annoyance for you. It's hard to practice the Dharma. There's times when I think about it and go, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? But, we all do that to some degree, because Tibetan Buddhism in particular is incredibly complicated. And we look at the Zen folks and think they have kind of an easy way of going because they just like to sit in meditation. But I'm making a judgment there that is probably not fair. But anyway, when we look at Tibetan Buddhism, there are so many things to practice. My gosh, in this tonight alone, I've given you like 50 things to think about, right? My gosh, to do all that, to get that all into our minds, we can become pretty impatient. We can look at ourselves and maybe lose a lot of the kind of ability to be with that, to be okay with that, kind of keep doing it day in and day out and not necessarily having huge changes in our minds. So this is what we're talking about here, is that kind of patience that we need to cultivate in regard to our own practice. Excuse me. He says the third type of patience is the patience of gaining certainty about the Dharma, kind of a slightly different way that Rinpoche talks about it. We do this by meditating on and understanding the meaning of the Lam Rim, and understanding and appreciating the extraordinary qualities of the three jewels, what he often calls the three rare sublime ones, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Being convinced of the crucial importance of attaining enlightenment and having certainty about the effectiveness of the path that leads there. When we have all these qualities, we will never lack the patience to persevere with our Dharma practice. So he does frame it with this idea of persevering, having that kind of enthusiasm to continue practice. But the idea is that it is primarily affected by our certainty around the Dharma, our continuing to investigate it, to be curious about it, to want to integrate it. That's how we keep it from manifesting as a sort of impatience around the Dharma. This is a different description from Geshe Lundap Sopa. Many of you know Geshe Sopa's wonderful 5 volumes on the Lamrim Chenmo. This is from the third one where he goes into the perfections. This is the third type of patience, is mental clarity about reality. It is understanding causation. When we do not know something, we have doubts about it. That makes us feel negative. Not liking a practice, not wanting to do a practice, or even if we do it, feeling uncomfortable and having reservations about the practice, are all aspects of impatience. In order for religious practitioners to be comfortable and inspired to practice, they must understand the causes, the nature, and the results of each practice. Because if we have that whole point of view of the causation that is involved in all this, well, then we feel very confident and we engage wholeheartedly in our practice of the Dharma without that impatience. So in this context, mental clarity means faith. Or we could say a trust without any negative reservations, or a pure motivation for doing the practice. Patience is using wisdom to see the reality of Dharma. So it's kind of different flavors to this. But the idea is that this is all about our practice of the Dharma and how we are able to keep it going. This enables us to hold religious practices in a positive light. We will admire them, like them, and become able to do them. So on your chart, you're going to see, let me actually go to the chart for this one because I think it might be easier to work with, because I don't really have time to go into all of these tonight, given where we're at timing wise. If I go back up here, you'll see that in the middle of the screen there is these 8 aspects that are given as the objects of definitely thinking about Dharma. We think about objects of faith, such as the 3 jewels that were mentioned and their qualities, objects to be cultivated, which are the 2 selflessnesses. These 2 ways of looking at emptiness of the person and emptiness of other phenomena besides the person. The desired objects, which are the powers of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that we can develop, that are the object of our desire. The objects to be adopted, which are virtuous deeds and their results. Objects to be discarded, non-virtuous deeds and their results. Objects of meditation, that is the goal to be achieved, enlightenment. Object of meditation, that is the method, all the paths of training to arrive at the state of enlightenment through bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, and so on. And finally, 8 objects of training subsequent to study and reflection. These are all the things we need to meditate on and know, such as impermanence and so on. I'm not going to go again into a huge explanation. It essentially covers everything the Buddha taught, but in a variety of categories so that we can kind of see that there are some things that are really useful for us to reflect on and think about to help us to encourage that dedication and patience that is willing to endure whatever hardships and whatever difficulties we might have in this path, that isn't going to become discouraged by them. And that way we have that level of patience. Okay. Now we do have a level of patience that is essentially around the selflessnesses and understanding emptiness. Emptiness is not an easy topic to understand, and we have to have a willingness to be okay with our not getting it at the time, being understanding that that is not going to be the case, that we're going to immediately get these teachings and switch is going to be flipped and suddenly we have perfect knowledge. So again, that was just a recap of those. The final thing is just really brief ways to practice this perfection. And as I said, I think it's really good if you can practice patience in small ways first, gain some victories. And I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have done that to some degree. But look to always keep expanding, pushing the envelope, getting beyond where you're practicing patience. I can be patient with these people and with these situations, but I'm not so good there yet. Well, then work at moving there. Put your own little plan together, do your meditations, reflect on some of these topics that we looked at tonight. How we reframe things when others are harming us, how we look at suffering in general that we have to experience, and try to incorporate those into your thinking through meditation and so on, so that they come to mind when you are actually faced with those situations. And then if you have a situation and they didn't come to mind, then you sit back on the cushion with more determination so that the next time you meet it, you will be more skillful in dealing with it. But don't beat yourself up because you're not there yet. We are trying, this is part of the difficulty of the Buddhist path, I think, too, is we're trying to reverse minds that have been this way since beginningless time, folks. Beginningless time is inconceivable. If we've had all that stuff since with no beginning, well, now we're trying to reverse it. We get this one lifetime where we feel like, oh, great, I've met the Dharma, where we can get very enthusiastic and think it's possible to actually accomplish this. It is possible, but it's not possible to accomplish it in just a few years or something. This is something that takes dedicated, concerted practice that does involve having that patience about, for thinking about the Dharma, engaging in the Dharma, as well as changing our minds in whatever suffering that we're experiencing. So I went just about to the end of the time. There it goes, 7:30. So let me see if there are questions before we conclude tonight. Know that again, on that second page of the handout, there's more of these ways to practice these to make them very powerful through these supreme reliance and all these other things, and uniting the other perfections into the practice of each one of them. You can read that through, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. No questions? No comments? Or if someone wants to share their experience? Yeah, Bill.
I have one question.
Okay.
Back to our opening prayers. What
Mhm.
is Sugata? What does that mean?
Sugata. Sugata is an epithet for the Buddha, which is translated usually as gone to bliss. Sugata are those. Gata is like in gate, paragate. It means to go or to gone. Su is bliss, gone to bliss. These are the beings who have gone to bliss.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Always wonder, what does that mean?
What is a Sugata? Yeah. There's a bunch of different epithets for the Buddha. A number of them mentioned in that prayer. Tathagata, gone to thusness. Sugata. Anyway, I'm not thinking of any others at the moment, but
That's the
Bhagawan.
one.
Bhagawan.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
A
Okay.
Bhagawan is like somebody who has destroyed the. I have to actually go back to the translation of that. I think it has to do with destroying all of the obscurations and what have you. Kind of having the idea of a sort of victor. But I have to go back to that one. I don't have that one right immediately at my memory in my memory. Let me strain really hard. Okay. Any other comments or questions tonight? Thanks, Bill. All right. Well, then, again, as I said, you're getting tons of teachings, even in just these 3 classes so far. We have 3 more classes. Look at the other perfections. Just be very kind to yourself in implementing these in your lives and see once more if there's just maybe one little thing that you can take from tonight. Maybe again, you heard something new or you heard something in a different way than you heard it previously. And you go, wow, that looks like something I could maybe try to work with. And then make that commitment. And that's great. Anything we do that keeps us moving in that direction is worthwhile. If we take all these teachings in and we don't do anything with them, well, then again, maybe not so effective. They often compare that to having all this wonderful medicine that you just keep in a medicine cabinet. You never take it. The Dharma is medicine. It's good medicine, but we have to take it. We have to use it. So anyway, you've got 2 weeks to work with these teachings in particular with the holiday next week. We'll reconvene on whatever that is, December 2nd, I think it is. Yeah, I think it's the 2nd. And we'll have 3 more classes in December so we can continue through the remaining perfections, which do become to some degree, well, after the 4th one, a little bit harder for us to implement on a day-to-day basis, but I'll try to keep it as practical as possible. I hope that's been something I've tried to do so far that I hope has been successful. But I think that can be a really key part of this. There's no point in looking at the perfections as some sort of ideal thing that's way off in the future. Like we need to know how to practice like this now, because as I always am pointing out, everything we do now has an effect on the future. And so if we ever want to achieve the state of a bodhisattva and engage in these perfections with bodhicitta in that much stronger way, and if we ever want to become a Buddha, well, it starts right now. It starts with what we're doing right now. All right, enough of a pep talk. Let's go ahead and do the final prayers for tonight, beginning with these 2 dedication prayers. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then the prayers for our precious teachers, recalling that we have to create the causes from our side to have these guides in our lives, as well as in the lives of others in this world, and to have their wishes fulfilled and so on. This is something we need to create that energy. So as we recite these prayers for these specific teachers, think that we're also creating the causes for all spiritual guides to have good health, long lives, for their wishes to be fulfilled, and for us and others to never be parted from perfect guides in all our lifetimes. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. And we dedicate also for all those beings we're holding in our heart right now, whose suffering moves us greatly, whether they are beings that we know, that we're already close to, or those whose situation in the world is difficult right now, that we've heard of and again are concerned about. I think that we're sending this positive energy out to these beings who have obstacles, illness, who are dying or who have died, and it becomes the cause to immediately remove their suffering and bring them all the causes that will help them to attain true peace and happiness. May all beings have these same results through what we've done here tonight and through all of our efforts. Wonderful. So again, have a very peaceful and safe holiday next week. And remember, again, the spirit of gratitude and even being grateful for the difficult people in your life, as we talked about tonight, that they are a part of our life that is actually a rich resource for us to mine our own kind of stores of patience. So you have that to look forward to if you are going to be with difficult people over the holidays. So, but otherwise, yes, do enjoy the time off, and I'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Okay. Be well, everyone.